Find somewhere comfortable tonight, wherever you are, stretched out, curled up, somewhere quiet or somewhere that is trying to be quiet. You don't need to follow any of this closely. You don't need to hold on to names or dates or distances. Just let the words come to you, the way a distant sound comes through an open window at night. Present, soft, and easy to release. We are going somewhere old tonight, somewhere that exists now mostly in sand and silence and the long memory of the earth. A road that was never really one road, but many roads, braided together across mountains and deserts and river valleys, stretching from the eastern edge of China all the way to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. A road that carried silk, yes, but also spices and glass and horses and stories and ideas and prayers and plagues and music and the quiet, patient movement of human lives. The Silk Road. And we are going to walk it by night. Not in a hurry, not cataloguing or memorizing, just moving slowly through the dark, the way travelers once did when the heat of the day had finally let go and the stars came out so thick and low that people said you could almost hear them. The way the desert breathes differently after sundown. The way all places feel older when the world is still. You don't need to go anywhere. You are already there. Just let the night settle around you, and we will begin. There is something worth knowing about the Silk Road before we go any further, and it is this. The name itself is an invention. A beautiful, poetic invention, but an invention nonetheless. The term was coined by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877. He was studying trade patterns across Central Asia, mapping the movement of goods and peoples across centuries, and he needed a name that captured the essence of this vast network. And the name stuck so completely that it is now almost impossible to imagine the route being called anything else. But the merchants who actually walked it, who loaded their camels at dawn and counted their steps through the Taklamakan Desert, who bartered at the crossroads markets of Samarkand and Kashgar, who arrived half exhausted at caravanserais and lay down on their mats with aching feet. Those people did not call it the Silk Road, the route, the way through. It was simply the world they moved through, the same way you move through your days without naming them. There is something gentle in that, something that makes the whole vast enterprise feel a little more human. The Silk Road was not one path, but a web of paths. At its fullest extent, the network stretched roughly 8,000 miles from the ancient Chinese capital of Chang'an, the city we now call Xi'an, westward through the Gobi Desert and the Taklamakan, over the Pamirs mountains, through Persia and Mesopotamia, all the way to Rome and Constantinople and the ports of the Mediterranean. Some branches dipped south toward India, others curved north through the Eurasian steppe. There were maritime routes as well, tracing the coastlines of Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. It was, in the truest sense, the circulatory system of the ancient world. And it was most alive at night. To understand why night mattered so much on the Silk Road, you have to first understand the deserts. The Taklamakan Desert sits in the heart of what is now the Xinjiang region of western China. Its name in the Uyghur language is sometimes translated as, "You go in, you don't come out." That translation is debated by scholars, but the sentiment is not entirely wrong. The Taklamakan is one of the largest shifting sand deserts in the world. It stretches roughly 1,000 kilometers from east to west. In summer, surface temperatures on the sand can reach 60 degrees Celsius. The air shimmers. The horizon dissolves. There is almost no water. Caravans did not cross the Taklamakan in the heat of day if they could help it. They moved at night. They would rest during the brutal midday hours, sheltering in the shadow of a dune or beneath a rough awning of cloth, sleeping fitfully while the heat pressed down. Then, as the sun began its long descent and the air started to loosen its grip, the caravan would stir. Camels would be loaded. Merchants would check their packs. And as the first stars appeared, faint at first, then brilliant, then overwhelming, the whole company would begin to move. The desert at night is a different world entirely. The sand, which had been a furnace, becomes cool and almost soft underfoot. The silence is vast in a way that is hard to describe to someone who has never been far from human noise. Not the silence of a room or a quiet street, but a silence with depth to it, a silence that seems to extend in all directions without limit. And above, the sky. There are very few places on earth where you can see the Milky Way, the way it appears over the Taklamakan on a clear night. No light pollution for hundreds of miles in any direction. The atmosphere is dry and still. The stars do not twinkle so much as they glow, steady and ancient, packed so densely across the sky that the darkness between them seems like the exception rather than the rule. Travelers wrote about this sky, not always in the language of wonder. They were practical people, merchants and soldiers and monks, not given to extended poetry, but the sky appears again and again in the accounts that survive. Because the sky was not just beautiful, it was useful. It was the map. Navigation by stars was not a simple or casual skill. It required years of practice and a deep familiarity with the seasonal movements of specific constellations. The Pleiades, a tight cluster of stars in the constellation Taurus, were used across many cultures to mark the agricultural calendar and to orient travelers. Polaris, the North Star, was fundamental to anyone moving across open ground in the Northern Hemisphere. The position of Orion, rising in the east, confirmed direction. The arc of the moon told the time. Silk Road merchants and their guides carried this knowledge the way we carry a phone today. It was practical, intimate, and constantly consulted. There is something deeply restful about that image, a caravan moving through the dark, feet quiet on the cool sand, the whole sky spread above like a ceiling someone had set on fire very gently, and a navigator watching the stars, the way a musician watches sheet music, not consciously reading each note, but feeling the shape of the whole. The Caravanserai was the other anchor of the night journey. These were way station inns, built at intervals along the main routes, roughly a day's travel apart. About 30 to 40 kilometers, the distance a loaded camel could comfortably walk in a day. The word caravanserai comes from the Persian, meaning roughly caravan palace, which is generous. Many were simple rectangular compounds, high walls of mud brick, a central courtyard for the animals, small cells around the perimeter for the travelers. But they were shelter. They were water. They were, in the most fundamental sense, safety. Arriving at a caravanserai after a long night's walk must have been one of the most deeply satisfying feelings a human body could experience. The gate opening in the dark. The smell of animals and wood smoke and whatever was cooking, the sounds of other languages, other accents, the soft percussion of a dozen different lives, all pausing in the same place for the same reason. To rest. The caravanserai was one of the great social inventions of the ancient world. It was a place where a Chinese silk merchant might sleep 10 feet from a Persian spice trader, a Byzantine monk, and a Sogdian banker. where a musician from Kucha might play for a crowd that had no common language but shared a common exhaustion, where news travelled. News of road conditions, of bandits, of political upheaval, of prices at the next market. Many caravanserais were free, funded by rulers, merchants, or religious institutions as acts of charity or political goodwill. You arrived, and you were given shelter. No questions. No obligation. The road had its own ethics. The ruins of these places are still scattered across Central Asia. Some have been preserved, many have crumbled back into the earth they were made from. But there is one site, in what is now Iran, near the city of Yazd, where a caravanserai has been restored, and you can still walk through its courtyard on a warm night and look up at the same stars the merchants saw, the same Milky Way, the same patient darkness. It is said that when the archaeologist Aurel Stein explored the ruins of the Silk Road oasis towns in the early 20th century, he found documents, paintings, and objects that had been sealed in a cave near Dunhuang for nearly 9 centuries. The cave, known now as the Cave of the 10,000 Buddhas, or the Mogao Caves, contained manuscripts in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, and several other languages. Someone had sealed all of this away. Carefully, deliberately, as if hoping someone would find it eventually. Someone did. The night keeps things. The dark is patient in ways that the daylight never quite manages to be. The Silk Road is often imagined as a story about goods, about silk bolts and spice sacks and precious stones moving from one end of the ancient world to the other. And it was that. But it was also, and perhaps more importantly, a story about people. Not famous people mostly, not emperors or generals, though they appear in the story too. The real story of the Silk Road belongs to the merchants who walked it, the guides who knew the desert paths, the translators who made conversation possible, the craftspeople who waited at either end, and the monks and missionaries and wandering scholars who used the trade routes to carry ideas as well as objects. Among all the peoples who shaped the Silk Road, one group stands out with particular clarity: the Sogdians. The Sogdians came from a region centered on the ancient cities of Samarkand and Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan. They were, by almost any measure, the most accomplished merchants of the ancient world. At their height, between roughly the 4th and 8th centuries CE, Sogdian trading colonies existed in cities from Persia to China. They were the connective tissue of the Silk Road. What made the Sogdians exceptional was not just their commercial instinct, though that was considerable. It was their linguistic facility. Sogdian merchants routinely spoke 4, 5, or 6 languages. They had to. Moving along the Silk Road meant passing through a dozen different political territories, each with its own language, its own currency, its own currency, its own currency, its own customs. A merchant who could not negotiate in the local tongue was a merchant who would be cheated. Sogdian became, over time, a kind of lingua franca of the Silk Road. A shared language that speakers of Chinese and Persian and Turkic and Sanskrit could use to meet somewhere in the middle. The way English functions now in international business, not everyone's first language, but a useful common ground. Letters, written by Sogdian merchants, have survived. Real letters, sent by real people, found in a watchtower near Dunhuang by Aurel Stein in 1907. They date to around 1330 EE. One is written by a merchant named Nanaidhat, stranded somewhere in China, writing home to his family in Samarkand. He reports that the Chinese emperor has fled his capital, that the roads are dangerous, that he has not been able to trade. He sounds tired. He sounds worried. He sounds, across 17 centuries, remarkably human. Another letter, from a woman named Nanidhat's mother, The same family, it seems, was never sent. It was found still sealed in its envelope, a small roll of paper inside a leather pouch. She had been waiting for her husband, she wrote. She had waited so long. If she had known it would be this long, she wrote, she would never have come. That letter was sealed in a watchtower for 1600 years. There is something about reading a private grief across that distance of time that is hard to name. It is not exactly sadness. It is more like recognition. The feeling that the distance between us and the past is not as vast as we sometimes imagine, that the woman who sat down somewhere in the desert dark to write that letter was carrying the same weight that people carry now. Waiting. Not knowing. Not knowing. The road asked a great deal of the people who travelled it. It asked endurance, first of all. A full journey along the Silk Road, from Chang'an to Constantinople, say, would take roughly 18 months to 2 years. Most merchants did not make the full journey. They traded in sections, passing goods from hand to hand, caravan to caravan, across the vast distance. A bolt of Chinese silk might change hands a dozen times before it arrived in Rome. Each exchange added value. Each exchange added distance. It asked adaptability. The high plateaus of Central Asia, where the wind never quite stops. The long, hot valleys of Persia. Each environment required different knowledge, different equipment, different rhythms of rest and movement. And it asked a willingness to be changed. This is perhaps the thing the Silk Road did that is least often talked about. It was not just a conduit for goods. It was a conduit for transformation. The people who travelled it came home different. They had heard different music, eaten different food, encountered different ideas about the nature of the world and the purpose of a life. They had slept beside strangers who became, over the long nights of a shared journey, something closer to friends. Buddhism travelled the Silk Road from India to China. So did Islam, moving west to east. So did Nestorian Christianity, which reached as far as Tang Dynasty China by the 7th century. Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, a dozen smaller traditions, all of them moving along the same dusty paths carried in the minds and hearts of travellers who were also simply trying to get somewhere. The great cave complex at Dunhuang, the Mogao Caves, is perhaps the most vivid surviving record of this exchange. The caves were carved into a cliff face over a period of roughly 1,000 years, beginning in the 4th century CE. Monks and wealthy merchants sponsored the carving and painting of each cave as an act of devotion. The result is an extraordinary archive of Buddhist art, but an art that is also a record of cultural mixture. In the paintings, you can see Chinese faces and Central Asian faces and Indian faces all within the same scene. Musical instruments from different traditions appear side by side. Textile patterns that originated in Persia appear on the robes of Buddhist saints. The visual language of the caves is not purely Chinese, not purely Indian, not purely Central Asian. It is all of those things at once, mixed together the way the Caravanserai mixed together the people who slept within its walls. The Mogao Caves are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They contain nearly 500 painted chambers. In the dark of the Gobi Desert night, the cliff face sits silent and still, the paintings sealed within. But during the day when the light comes in, the colours are still astonishing. Lapis lazuli blue, ground from stone that came from the mines of Badakhshan in what is now Afghanistan, carried hundreds of miles along the Silk Road to be mixed into paint in a cave in the Chinese desert. Blue made from rock, carried by hand across mountains and deserts to end up on the wall of a cave where it has been quietly glowing for over 1,000 years. That is the Silk Road. Not everything that moved along the Silk Road was visible in the light of day. Some of the most consequential things that traveled these routes were invisible. Ideas, diseases, technologies, ways of thinking about time and number and the movement of stars. Mathematics, for instance. The numerical system we use today, the digits 0 through 9, the concept of place value, the idea of 0 as a number in its own right rather than simply an absence, originated in India and moved westward along the Silk Road through Persian and Arab scholars before arriving in Europe in the medieval period. When it arrived, it quietly revolutionized everything. Commerce, architecture, astronomy, the ability to calculate, to record, to plan at scales that had previously been impossible. We do not think about this when we look at a number. We do not think about the journey it took to get to us. But the number in your phone, the number on your door, the number of hours you have slept tonight, all of that is the inheritance of a journey along an ancient road. Music traveled too. The pipa, a 4-stringed lute that is one of the most beloved instruments in Chinese classical music, has its origins in instruments that came from Persia and Central Asia along the Silk Road. Instruments crossed borders and were absorbed into new musical traditions, adapted, retuned, given new names, played in new contexts until their origins were almost invisible. There is a painting in the Mogao caves that shows an apsara, a celestial being, a figure from Buddhist cosmology, playing a pipa while floating through the air. The instrument is foreign. The context is Buddhist. The painter was probably Chinese. The whole image is a quiet record of how thoroughly the Silk Road mixed things together, until the categories of foreign and familiar stopped making much sense. Papermaking is another story worth telling. Paper was invented in China, probably in the 2nd century CE, though some evidence suggests even earlier. For centuries, the technique was a closely guarded secret. Then, in 751 CE, a battle was fought on the banks of the Talas River in Central Asia between the armies of the Tang dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate. The Tang forces were defeated. Among the prisoners taken were Chinese papermakers. Within years, paper mills were operating in Samarkand. Within decades, the technology had spread across the Islamic world and eventually into Europe. A military defeat carried a technology westward, and the technology changed the world. Knowledge accumulated in ways it never could on expensive parchment or fragile papyrus. And eventually, paper reached Europe, and the conditions were in place for Gutenberg's press, and for the printing of books in enormous quantities, and for the slow, patient spread of literacy that reshaped the world. All of it tracing back in a long and winding line to a battle on a river in Central Asia in the 8th century. And the knowledge carried in the hands of prisoners who knew how to make something from wood pulp and water. The Silk Road carried disease as well, and this is worth acknowledging with honesty. The same routes that moved silk and spices and ideas also moved pathogens. The Black Death, which killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, is now understood to have originated in Central Asia and spread westward along the Silk Road's trade networks. The bacterium Yersinia pestis moved with the caravans, carried in the bodies of rats and fleas that hitched rides in the grain sacks and merchandise of traveling merchants. It is one of the more difficult truths about interconnection. But even here, there is something worth noticing. The communities that survived the plague, the ones that eventually developed immunity and rebuilt, were also the communities that had been most connected, that had traded and exchanged and mixed for centuries. The very interconnection that made them vulnerable to the disease was also, over the long course of history, part of what made them resilient. The road gives and the road takes. It has always been that way. There is a particular kind of night on the Silk Road that travelers described again and again in their accounts. The night before a difficult crossing, before the Pamirs passes, before the long waterless stretch of the Taklamakan. The caravan would stop, and there would be a kind of collective stillness. Animals resting, fires burning low, people lying on their mats looking up at the stars with the particular quality of attention that comes when you know tomorrow will be hard. The Buddhist monk Xuanzang described something like this in his account of his journey from China to India in the 7th century CE. He traveled alone for much of his journey without official permission, crossing the desert in secret. He wrote about nights in the desert when the silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat, when the stars were so bright they seemed to press down. When the distance between where he was and where he was going felt less like geography and more like a quality of the mind. He was going to find Buddhist scriptures in India. He spent 17 years on the road. He came back with 657 texts loaded onto 20 horses. He spent the rest of his life translating them. The journey he made became the basis for one of the great works of Chinese literature, the novel Journey to the West, written 8 centuries after his death. In the novel, the monk is accompanied by a monkey king, a pig spirit, and a water demon. The desert crossings become mythological. The difficulties become adventures. But the real journey was a man alone in the dark, walking, trusting the stars, carrying a question he had decided was worth everything to answer. That is also the Silk Road. If the desert was the space between, the great cities of the Silk Road were the places where everything converged, where the road's many threads pulled together into something dense and brilliant and alive. God. The name alone has a quality of distance to it, a sound like something half remembered. It sits now in modern Uzbekistan, a city of nearly 500,000 people, with wide Soviet-era boulevards and ancient mosques, and a market where you can still buy dried fruit and hand-painted ceramics and carpets in colors that seem to carry their own light. But in the period of its greatest flourishing, roughly the 7th through the 15th century CE, Samarkand was one of the most extraordinary cities in the world. It sat at the crossroads of the main Silk Road routes, the place where the paths from China and India and Persia and the steppe all met and tangled together. Everything passed through Samarkand. Everyone stopped in Samarkand. The Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang visited in the early 7th century and described a city of skilled craftspeople and wealthy merchants, a city where the markets were full of goods from every corner of the known world. A city, he noted, that was almost entirely Zoroastrian at the time, its temples tended by priests who kept sacred fires burning continuously. A century later, the city had converted to Islam. The sacred fires were extinguished. New mosques rose where temples had stood. The language of the market shifted. And yet the city continued. It adapted, the way all cities that survive long enough must adapt. The greatest period of Samarkand's glory came under Timur, the conqueror known in the West as Tamerlane, who made it his capital in the late 14th century. Timur was a man of extraordinary violence and extraordinary taste. His military campaigns left pyramids of skulls across Central Asia and Persia and India. His building projects left behind some of the most beautiful architecture the world has ever seen. The Registan, the great public square at the heart of Samarkand, is faced on 3 sides by enormous madrasas, Islamic schools, their facades covered in geometric tilework in shades of blue and turquoise and gold that seem to shift color as the light changes. The central portal of the Ulugh-Beg Madrasa, built in the 1420s, is covered in a mosaic of stars. Not decorative stars, or not only decorative, the pattern encodes actual astronomical knowledge, a record of the sky above Samarkand rendered in glazed tile. Ulugh-Beg, Timur's grandson, was one of the great astronomers of the medieval world. He built an observatory on a hill outside Samarkand that contained a sextant so large, its arc carved directly into the bedrock of the hill, stretching 40 meters underground, that it could measure the position of stars with an accuracy not surpassed in Europe for another 2 centuries. His star catalogue, compiled in the 1420s, listed the positions of over 1,000 stars with a precision that modern astronomers have confirmed using modern instruments. He was watching the same stars the caravan merchants used to navigate the desert. He was just watching them more carefully. There is something beautiful in that continuity. The merchant lying on his mat in the desert, looking up at Orion and thinking about direction. The astronomer in his tower, looking at the same Orion and thinking about mathematics, both of them under the same sky. Both of them trying in their different ways to understand where they were. Kashgar sits at the other end of the Taklamakan, at the foot of the Pamir mountains, where the routes from China converged before climbing toward the west. It was, for much of the Silk Road's history, the last Chinese city before the vast strangeness of Central Asia, or the first, depending on which direction you were traveling. The Sunday market at Kashgar was, by many accounts, one of the great spectacles of the ancient world. Merchants came from every direction, from China to the east, from Persia and the Arab world to the west, from India to the south, from the Kazakh steppe to the north. The market was a city within a city. Animals traded in one section, spices in another, textiles in another, metalwork in another. A traveller arriving in Kashgar on a Sunday morning in, say, the 9th century CE would have heard a dozen languages simultaneously, would have smelled cinnamon and horse dung and roasting meat and something floral and sweet that might have been rosewater, would have seen faces from every part of the known world, dressed in 100 different ways, all moving through the same crowded space with the same focused energy of people who have come to do business. The market still happens in Kashgar, not on quite the same scale, and the goods have changed, but the Sunday market in Kashgar is still a place where you can stand in a crowd and hear multiple languages and feel, dimly, the weight of all those centuries of exchange. By night, the cities of the Silk Road had a different quality. The market stalls were dark. The great mosques and temples were lit from within, their windows glowing. The caravanserais were full of resting travelers. The streets, in most cities, were quiet. The Islamic tradition of keeping the night peaceful, of not disturbing the sleep of neighbors, was widely observed. But in some cities, the night was not entirely still. In Tang Dynasty Chang'an, the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, the cosmopolitan capital of the most powerful empire of its age, the night markets were famous. The city was divided into wards, each sealed at night by gates that were locked at curfew. But within the entertainment districts, the wine shops and music halls stayed open. Sogdian wine, imported from Central Asia, made from grapes grown in the Fergana Valley, was available in the taverns of Chang'an, served by Sogdian hostesses who were renowned in the poetry of the Tang period for their beauty and their dancing. Tang dynasty poets wrote about these taverns with a mixture of delight and melancholy that feels very contemporary. The pleasure of the wine, the strangeness of being far from home, the music, which was foreign and therefore thrilling, the night, which was the same night everywhere. One poet, Li Bai, perhaps the most celebrated poet in Chinese history, wrote repeatedly about drinking under the moon, about the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be, about the way the night made everything both clearer and more uncertain. He was not writing about the Silk Road specifically, but he was writing from a city that the Silk Road had made, in a culture that the Silk Road had shaped, drinking wine that the Silk Road had carried. The night was full of that kind of invisible inheritance. The Silk Road began to fade, as all things eventually do, not with a single ending, but with a slow and patient diminishment. The Mongol Empire, which had briefly unified the entire route under a single political authority in the 13th century, allowing a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo to travel from Europe to China and back, eventually fragmented. The roads became less safe. The great trading cities fell into other hands, or were destroyed in wars, or simply declined as the routes shifted. The maritime trade routes began to take over. When Vasco da Gama sailed around the southern tip of Africa in 1498 and opened a direct sea route from Europe to India, the economics of the overland route changed permanently. Ships could carry more than camels. Ships were faster. The sea route bypassed the middlemen, the Silk Road merchants who had profited for centuries from their position between east and west. The great caravanserais began to empty. The desert paths grew fainter. The cities that had lived on trade found other ways to survive, or they did not survive at all. Some of the oasis towns along the Taklamakan route were simply abandoned, swallowed back into the desert, their ruins preserved by the extreme dryness of the air. It is those ruins that archaeologists began exploring in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Aurel Stein, the Hungarian-British explorer and archaeologist, made 4 expeditions to the region between 1900 and 1930. He found cities buried under sand, temples with paintings still intact on their walls, documents, coins, textiles, wooden tacked on their walls, documents, coins, textiles, wooden scripts. He also, controversially, removed enormous quantities of material from the sites he explored and brought them back to museums in London and Calcutta. The question of who those objects belong to, whether they are better preserved in distant museums or whether they should be returned to the countries where they were found, is a question that has not been resolved and probably will not be resolved quickly. It is one of those questions that the Silk Road itself seems to pose. What does it mean for something to belong somewhere when it was made to travel? The Mogao caves near Dunhuang, which we visited earlier in this long night, were sealed in the 11th century. No one is entirely certain why. The most widely accepted theory is that they were sealed to protect their contents from an advancing army. Possibly the Western Xia, a kingdom that controlled the region in the 11th century. The monk who sealed the cave must have hoped to come back. He never did. The cave sat undisturbed for nearly 900 years, until a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who had appointed himself caretaker of the Mogao site, accidentally broke through a wall in 1900 and found himself looking at 40,000 manuscripts and paintings stacked from floor to ceiling in a small side chamber. He did not immediately understand what he had found. He wrote to the local authorities. He was told, essentially, that there was no money to deal with it. He waited. And then, in 1907, Aurel Stein arrived, and the contents of the cave began their long journey into the museums and libraries of the world. The Diamond Sutra, the world's oldest dated printed book, is now in the British Library in London. And the caves themselves are still there, in the desert outside Dunhuang, carved into their cliff face, the remaining paintings still glowing in the dark. The Silk Road is often talked about now in the context of its modern revival. The language of the ancient road is being used to describe something very contemporary, very political, very different from the slow, human-scaled movement of camels and merchants across the desert. Whether the comparison holds is a question for economists and historians and diplomats. But there is something worth noticing in the impulse to reach back to the ancient road for a metaphor, when different cultures could meet and trade and mix without erasing each other. When the road between them was long and difficult, but not, ultimately, impassable. That is perhaps more of a hope than a historical reality. The Silk Road had its violence, its exploitation, its plague. The Caravanserai was not always welcoming, the desert was not always navigable. The merchants were not always honest. But it also had its monks carrying scriptures across mountains they had no business crossing alone. Its musicians playing for audiences who did not speak their language. Its letters written in the dark by people who were waiting, who were tired, who were far from home and hoping that someone, eventually, would read what they had written. The dark is patient, and what it keeps for a very long time. Somewhere in the Taklamakan tonight, the sand is cool. The stars are the same stars they have always been. If you were there, if you could be there, just for a moment, in the quiet after the heat has let go, you might hear something. Not voices exactly, more like the echo of voices, the particular quality of silence that a place holds when it has been full of human sound for a very long time, and then grown quiet. A silence that is not empty. A gets. There is a small oasis town called Dunhuang that sits at the edge of the Gobi Desert, where the Silk Road routes converge before the long crossing of the Taklamakan. Outside the town, there are sand dunes called Mingsha Mountain, the singing sand dunes, named for the sound the sand makes in the wind, a low, resonant hum that travelers have described for centuries as something between music and breathing. At night, the dunes are extraordinary. The sand holds the warmth of the day for a while and then slowly releases it, so that if you press your hand flat against the slope of a dune in the early night, it is still warm. The stars above Dunhuang are among the most visible in China. The Milky Way appears on a clear night as a broad river of light crossing the sky from horizon to horizon. People go there now as tourists to watch the stars. They ride camels along the base of the dunes in the early evening, the same way travelers did 1,000 years ago, and they look up at the same sky and they feel, most of them feel, something that is hard to name, a sense of continuity. The feeling that they are very small and very briefly here, and that the sky is very large and very old, and that this is, somehow, all right. The monks who painted the Mogao caves worked by lamplight, small clay lamps burning sesame oil, their flames barely enough to illuminate the section of wall directly in front of the painter's face. The caves' lamps were small. A painter working on a ceiling fresco would have seen only a few square feet of their work at a time. The rest of the image lost in the surrounding dark. They painted anyway. They trusted that the whole would be beautiful even when they could only see a fragment of it. They trusted that the light, small as it was enough to work by. There is something in that image worth carrying into sleep tonight. The idea that you do not need to see the whole, that the small circle of light immediately around you is enough to keep moving by, that the vast dark beyond it is not threatening but simply patient, simply present, simply the context in which the small, warm light exists. The road goes on in the dark. It has always gone on in the dark. And the people who walked it, tired, carrying things, far from home, watching the stars for direction, they kept walking. Not because they were certain, not because the road was safe or the destination was guaranteed, but because the walking itself was something, because the movement through the dark, step by step, was its own kind of answer to the question of what to do with a difficult night. You are not on a desert road. You are somewhere warm, somewhere still, and the night around you is not the night of the Taklamakan. But the stars above you, if you could see them, are the same stars, the same ancient light, patient and unhurried, that guided the caravans home. And so we leave it here, somewhere between the dunes and the dark, somewhere in the long quiet after the caravan has passed. The road is still. The sand is cool. The stars are doing what they have always done. You carried enough today. You can set it down now. Drift if you're ready. Sleep well.